So I'm going to talk about accessibility, the good, the bad, and the ugly in the Plone context. And first I want to give a disclaimer. I am not an accessibility expert by any means. That would be the guy you're looking for that. And I'm so glad that Paul is here because I hope that he will correct me whenever I say something wrong, which is very possible. So I'm not going to explain the standards in any depth or go into the details of this and that about, you know, what the different levels are for the different standards. I'm also not a developer, so I'm not going to provide detailed HTML examples of any of these things. I run the company Jazzcarta. We develop Plone websites, among other things. And this fall, we've been doing, we're right in the process of doing a project. I'm going to take this out so I don't have to feel glued to it. Does that work okay still? Hopefully. We're doing a project for a client whose website was a big educational institution, and guess what? They got audited. Hello. We're just moving along, so I'm going to just keep talking while you maybe can plug me in. Does that sound reasonable? Yeah, that's the adapter I need.
I'm very sorry.
That's okay. Oops, upside down.
Right.
Anyway, I'm just going to keep talking if that's okay. We're doing a project for a client who's a part of a large institution that is working on their accessibility issues, and they got audited. This website got audited and discovered, you know, 1 million problems, not 1 million, but a scary number of problems. And so we are, awesome. Now, does anybody know how to get my notes onto this while that is there? Is anybody like a expert at Keynote? Boy, I always have just walked in and it just worked magically. So I suppose I have to do some setting here. Sorry, I'll keep talking while he's doing the magic thing that. Oh, it's a display setting. Yeah, okay. Magic. Management, okay. Sorry that we didn't take care of this ahead of time, folks. Yeah, but it's still not showing the notes. How do I get it to show the notes? Sorry to be such a ditz. Oh, that's that thing. Ha. Yay, Alex. All right. And just for fun, there was the title. Okay, so we're doing this project to fix all these problems that were found in this Plone website. And I learned a whole lot in the process. I've never had to go through this process before in such detail. So I'm just going to share information that I learned about kind of what can go wrong with a Plone site, highly customized Plone site, in the realm of accessibility. So first of all, what does it mean? Accessibility, often abbreviated this way, A11Y, although it's really easier in my opinion to say accessibility. Anyway, it's the idea is to be able to make your web content and your applications accessible or usable to people with all types of disabilities. And there are sort of several categories of areas that you need to think about for accessibility. One is in your theme, and that has a lot to do with the colors and contrasts. Color blindness is obviously an issue. People with limited visual like if I took off my glasses, or any of you wearing glasses took off your glasses, you'd have a problem with things that had not appropriate contrast. Also just motor impairments, if things are really tiny, trying to touch buttons on a mobile screen, or even with a mouse, that can be an issue. So this is the responsibility of the designers of the site. So for example, in this case, that banner with the date has a contrast ratio of 1.9 to 1, which fails in this case. Now, obviously, that's not like a huge big deal, but you want to be kind to your users and not have them have problems like that. A next sort of bucket of issues I think of are landmarks. These are things embedded in the HTML structure of the page to explain the content on the page. These are defined, these HTML structures are defined in various standards, and they allow screen readers to work, basically. This is the responsibility of the developers to make sure that this HTML structure is correct. So there are, HTML5 defines tags, like instead of using a div or something, you'd use a button because it says what it is. And then the ARIA standard provides attributes that convey the same information. And we'll talk a little bit more about the standards later, but basically you want to be sure that all that information is in your code, your HTML code, so the screen readers can work and people can understand and navigate, like using tabs on the keyboard to go through your site, that they can navigate easily. Okay, so that was developers and designers. Now on to things that are responsibility of the editors. The media, whether it be images or videos, that content should be available somehow to people with visual disabilities. So images need to have alt text attributes defined, and videos should be captioned. Some way to convey the meaning of visual elements to people who cannot actually see them. And I'm not going to talk very much about this because we didn't have a lot of, I'm not going to talk a lot about video content because we didn't have really any video content on the site, but I am going to talk a fair amount about alt text because that really came up. So this is an editor responsibility. And finally, text itself. It needs to be readable. It needs to be understandable easily to your particular audience. And that is obviously the responsibility of the content editors. I want to emphasize understandable by your audience. These are little snippets from the website that I'm going to be talking about, which is an highly academic website. So this is a snippet of text. A story of antiquity reads as an endless cycle of accident, blah, 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 blah. The target audience here is, PhDs in classical studies. So it's going to have a different style and level of text, but you have to be really conscious that your audience is able to understand what you're doing, what you're talking about. All right, so there's sort of an alphabet soup of standards. I'm just going to kind of name them because I'm going to be talking about them very, very briefly. So the WC3 is the World Wide Web Consortium, and WAI is their Web Accessibility Initiative. I'm going to have to read from my cheat sheet here. So that's like a standards body, or a body that determines these guidelines that we're going to be talking about. WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This was developed through the W3C process. ATAG stands for Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines. So this is about making authoring tools accessible and helping authors to create web content that is accessible, for example, with quality or accessibility checkers. HTML5, as I mentioned, provides new sets of elements that you can use to indicate what the intent, what the purpose, what the function of any given text on your site is. However, not all browsers support all these features. That's getting better. It may even be not an issue anymore. But the idea is that in addition to using things like the tags like header and footer and nav, you should also use WAI's ARIA standards. ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. That's been around longer than HTML5, and it provides a set of attributes which provide the same kind of cues to what is going on here. So you might do a header tag, but you might also have an ARIA label that says it's a header. So your bases are covered in that way. Yeah.
One thing we often see is that if we point people to such standards, they overuse it. So marking, for example, a button with an area role button in some way is that style.
Okay.
So
I didn't know that. So great. So what he said. But there are some cases where you do want to do both, right?
There are cases where you want to do both, but that mostly has to do with forms. Forms are still
Forms are okay. All right. So great. So a lot of the browsers now support the major tags, but forms are still an issue.
all screen readers
Okay.
that currently use forms HTML5.
So Paul says all screen readers do support HTML5, but forms are still a edge case, and you do need to use ARIA tags. So, all right. So those are some buzzwords that'll come in handy in a few minutes. So the question is why? Why is this important? Why do we want to do it? And half of that story is because it's the right thing to do. It's a good thing to do. You know, you want people of all abilities to be able to access your content and read it, be able to navigate it, be able to use it, be able to use your shopping carts and your forums, et cetera. But also it's not just a niche thing, because this is not just something for blind people, literally blind people, which is a small segment of the population, but a lot of people, don't have great vision, and if you're out in the sun trying to look at a screen, it gets very much more difficult to see the contrasts. So there are a lot of situations where a much larger percent of the population is going to have problems with a site that does not have good accessibility. And also, by the way, all our favorite search engines, crawlers, are basically like blind users who are reading your site and indexing your content based strictly on the HTML that they're reading, not based on, actually seeing it. So it's good for your SEO, your search engine optimization. This is a good thing to do. But also, there might be a gun to your head. It's the law, at least in the States. If you've got public funding, any kind of public funding that has funded your website, you're supposed to comply with accessibility standards. So you might be audited like NYU was, and therefore you should do this. So out of the box, the Plone community's goal has always, from the very beginning, it's been a super important thing in the Plone community to comply with the most recent accessibility standards. So we've got a better story than a lot of pieces of software used on the web do. The current state, and this is where Paul is going to probably be able to correct me, 4.3 is mostly WCAG, if that's the right way to pronounce it, compliant, although there were some sort of structural, remember good old DLDT structures and portlets that prevented really complete conformance, but it's pretty good in the WCAG area, and it's got, I believe the most recent Plone 4.3 versions have ARIA tags as well, right? Plone 5 made a great leap forward because we got rid of those DLDT tags and we're able to do even more. So it's much more completely WCAG conformant, got the ARIA tags, and it's also A-tag conformant, kind of a lot. The editors are usable, as I understand it, but it doesn't have all of A-tag like the quality checkers and stuff side of A-tag. It doesn't have that. But people using screen readers can create content with Plone 5, which is awesome. All right, so Plone's got a pretty good story there out of the box. But if you've got a heavily customized site, complex site, of course, there are things that can go wrong. So this is a story about, in real life, what can go wrong. Case study is the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, which is an institute at New York University in New York City. It's a center for graduate research. It started to use Plone in 2011. It's been on Plone for a long time. They redesigned, and we were the firm hired to do this, they redesigned and upgraded their site to 4.3 in 2016, so not so terribly long ago. But then this year they had an institutional audit, and a whole lot of problems popped up, and we are now in the process of fixing them. So I'm going to now have a series of really dry slides, which we can stop and talk about, but I'm just kind of going to breeze through and tell you about what problems were found, kind of bunched by category, because I found it kind of interesting to see what were the types of issues that popped up. So in the realm of design, 9 issues were found. 3 of them had to do with color, contrast, opacity, those kinds of things that we were talking about before. 2 of them had to do with the design of the slider. Sliders are kind of problematic in general for accessibility conformance, and in this case they were completely impossible to use. There were no controls, and it was not accessible whatsoever. So to quote one of the developers, Jesse Snyder, if any of you know him, one of the developers on this project, one of the Jazzcarta developers, quote, "Sliders are bad, but it's possible to make them worse." And we definitely made them worse, but it was really the designer's fault that made them, and the client too, because they had someone who thought, oh, it would look so clunky to have controls on the slider. So we wound up with a completely inaccessible slider. And then one was due to the lack of an explicit submit option on a filtering kind of page. So. All right, just the HTML firm that the HTML code for the sort of template that was used in the Diazo theming process was produced by the design firm. So we were essentially taking the HTML that they produced for the overall page and shoving Plone's content into it, complete with Plone's, markup and accessibility compliant stuff, but there were parts of the designer's code that were a accessibility fail. 3 issues around the code for the mobile navigation search, the hamburger menu basically on mobile, and the search, which is one of those typical, you see a little search thing and you click it and it drops down magically and you fill it in. The way that their designer had implemented that, and I think a lot of people don't think of this a whole lot about how to do this well, those kind of drop-down features. Yeah, there were issues there. There was some bad header markup that actually might have been cruft left over from before rather than the designer, I'm not sure. But yeah, there were a lot of little things, bad header markup. A view more link on a news item is one of those pages where you click view more. It doesn't do a pagination, but it just like fills in underneath. And that was, that didn't have appropriate like ARIA tag or HTML5 markup to explain what it was. Should have been a button where it was, I don't know what it was, a link or something. One was due to inappropriate header levels. You're supposed to H1, H2, H3, H4 are supposed to be logically used on a page, and there was an issue with that. One was due to not hiding advanced the advanced search. They didn't want to make advanced search available, so they hid it using CSS, but they didn't bother to hide it from screen readers, so whoops. So that was an issue. All right. Customizations that we did. There were 9 issues found there. There were some redundant, there were 3 redundant adjacent links on custom views, like where you would have an image and then like an image, a picture of a person, and then the person's name. With both of them would be linked to things, but they would be 2 separate links, and you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to enclose the whole link in one thing. So that was 3 issues. 3 were just weird markup on custom content types that weren't appropriate. 2 were due to missing alt text for images that were things that, as developers, we should have like filled them in appropriately or provided a way for the editors to fill them in. So there were 2 of those. And one was a weird one, they wanted their news and events pages to like not have news and events at the top. And so there was no H1 tag on those pages. So that was a weird sort of design-driven thing. That was a problem. All right, there were. I think I'm categorizing this right. There's a Plone 4.3 site, so it's not going to be the markup that we're inserting into the Diazo theme is not going to be perfect to start with. And there were a bunch of things that were a problem. There were missing landmarks, 12, a bunch of these issues were just little issues where the landmarks, you know, like, this is the main body content, and this over here is a portlet and a side, and this over here is the top nav versus the main nav. Those kind of explanatory labels were missing, or landmarks were missing. 3 had to do with search and other forms, labels, again, missing. 1 had to do with the calendar portlet. The native Plone calendar portlet has like MTW, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and just MTW style, which is completely unexplained, so that's like not very useful. So 1 was about that, ambiguous column headings. 1 was bad nav markup. Another one for the main template markup, and another was that the pages were missing telling you what language they were in. We had then 13 additional so there were a lot of kind of Plone markup issues. The previous batch was things that I believe are fixed in Plone 5, and this batch is things that I don't think are fixed in Plone 5, and Paul should correct me if I'm wrong. So 5 had to do with including title attributes on links and images, which I gather from our contact at NYU that you're not supposed to do this anymore. So we had to get rid of those. 4 were missing alt text fields on lead images. So we used the usual Plone stuff, you know, which depending on whether it was an archetypes content type or a dexterity content type, that, you know, we added lead images to things, and that sort of stuff that you bring in to when you add a lead image, it doesn't include a way to fill in alt text for the image. So that's an issue, and it isn't filled in automatically or whatever. So that had to be addressed. Then there were 3 missing empty alt text attributes, by which I mean alt text equals double quotes, or, you know, so it's like a null alt text. So that's required to suppress a screen reader from blabbing on about, you know, alt text, and that was missing in 3 cases. There are times when you do want to suppress alt text when an image is purely decorative, for example, and so that was an issue. And then there was another problem using metadata for an image that was, oh God. So you're adding an image in a rich text field, and Plone, like, handily fills in something for alt text in that case based on the image's title or description. I think it takes description. It used to do based on file name, which was completely useless, and this was the case for 4.3, which is what they had. But now I believe it uses description or title, but that's not really appropriate either. When you're dragging one of your images from, you know, an image object on your site and using it in a rich text field, you need contextual alt text. You need to say what the image means in the context of this page you're writing. It's not so useful to just drag in whatever the generic description was of the image. And we don't really address that in Plone at all now, and I think that's a problem. So we actually invented a way to let content editors do that, and we also invented a way where it was required for them to do that. So let's see. So that's that. All right, then we had a couple of add-ons issues, and they were both from FTW Calendar, which is, we're using the one that uses, this is a add-on that uses the fullcalendar.io JS JavaScript library, and the version that the 4.3 add-on uses does not have accessibility built into it. So that calendar was kind of a mess, although resulted in 2 issues. I'm guessing that the latest version of that JavaScript library, it probably has these problems fixed, and hopefully the Plone 5 add-on uses that latest version, but I don't know. Anyway, there were 2 issues there having to do with like a presentation function disconnect and things that should have been buttons that weren't. There were 3 issues with third-party widgets. So here's a little cautionary note. If you're going to shove third-party widget in, like add this, for example, it turns out add this is a real mess accessibility-wise. So if you want your website to be accessible, don't use add this, because it's a disaster. We just wound up taking it off the site. So be careful when you're using third-party widgets. In this case, one of them was due to add this. One was due to this Voyant Tools word cloud thing that they used on one of their pages. They also just got rid of that. And one was due to NYU's library search, which is called Bobcat. This little search widget that they were required to insert in their pages, which was not accessible. All right, and finally, there was a few content issues, missing alt text, and one of those adjacent redundant link things that needed to be fixed manually. All right, so that was a whole raft of just details of issues that we found that I bet are pretty typical for a lot of sites that are, that are heavily customized, as opposed to keeping Plone's markup largely intact and doing a much lighter customization of the theme and a much lighter customization of custom content types and this kind of thing. Then this site has a number of custom content types, which is where a lot of the issues were, et cetera. So I wanted to kind of step back and think about this, having been through this project, most of this project, and talk about what can we learn from this that might be useful in the Plone world. And the first one is alt text to me. This should be in context. When you're in rich text editors, you should be describing the image in context. You should allow for it to be null for a decorative image. Yeah, and the image title or certainly file name are not going to be necessarily correct there. So you need to provide editors a way to enter alt text for images on a image by image basis within the context of the page they're editing. This business I mentioned before about having title attributes on images and links. Screen readers ignore them, but they're kind of annoying, and they're used in tooltips for some browsers, which can be like disruptive. If this thing has a description that's 1 word long, and this thing has a description that's 5 sentences long, it's really weird to get and the tooltips show in your main nav bar. That's kind of maybe not so good. And it's also, back in the day, people used those things to like overload their pages, like to juice up their SEO, put in lots of keywords for search engines in hopes that it would improve things. And that's annoying too. So really, we should just remove them, and you should definitely never have a blank one. Using buttons for actions rather than links. So this was kind of a common HTML4 trope. And I guess it's still pretty commonly used and needs to change. It's sort of, yeah, we should be more careful about this and make sure that when a link, make sure when we are using an A tag that it really is a link to a page, as opposed to a submit or a sign up or a whatever kind of a thing. It might not even be on a form, but if its intent is more like a do something rather than visit a web page, it should be a button. So we need to be careful, be more aware of that. Modal dialogues, drop-down things could also be improved, and maybe this is better in newer Plone 5 Barceloneta, and I don't know how this is, but the old way to do these kind of things were progressive enhancements, I think I've been told, where you assume that there is no JavaScript working on the site, and so you use basic HTML, and then if there is JavaScript, you sort of add things progressively to make it more cool. But that leads to odd structures, and it was kind of a mess. This stuff was all designed by the designer, who's actually, or the code was written by the design firm, and they're actually quite intelligent people who know a lot about this sort of thing. But it's not yet really common practice, my impression is, from our developers to do this kind of right. So you need to handle, you need to say what the things are and handle focus, you know, not get caught in a trap where your tab key just doesn't get you out of things. You need to be able to navigate from the keyboard, and you need to be able to enter, you know, to enter things from the keyboard. So being able to completely, you know, work a mobile hamburger menu that it might have, you know, additional drop downs that come out because it's layered. You know, this is something that you really need to think about. So Alec Mitchell, one of our developers, wound up being handed this problem, and there were a whole bunch of issues all related around this, and he wound up finding at this URL what he thought was a really good model for how to do this. And he thought it would be a really useful thing. And he said it was kind of an eye-opener for him. It was stuff that he hadn't really thought about before for good ways to handle those kind of situations. So he suggested that it would be a really good thing to think about looking at the Plone, various places where Plone uses those kind of overlays, like in the toolbar, for example, and doing them in a different way than it is now so that they're more accessible. So that's a definite Plone improvement possibility. Using buttons for actions, not links. Oops, did I just went the wrong way? Sorry. And then for editors, it'd be really helpful to have page checkers, accessibility checkers built into Plone, page level checking. So as the editor is editing, or at least as when they save, they could get a report, and then also overall site checking, like on a control panel, to have like a report so you can, so an admin can go in and find where the accessibility issues are, review the overall state, see how you're doing. That'd be really handy. Castle CMS has this as part of it, and we could really learn, I think, from what they've done there. And I think this would be a really, really good thing to put into Plone. One of the things that I would love to see be part of the Sorrento sprint, for example, to address that. So designers should be running accessibility checking tools as part of their process. Paul has talked about this a lot in the past, and yeah, clearly our designers didn't. They actually produced generally good stuff, but the contrast issues and the hamburger menu issues were definitely a problem. So you should make sure when you are hiring a design firm that they're going to do this. And they can do that straight on their mock-ups. They're making HTML, so they can just run the checkers right on their HTML pages. For developers, it would be really a good practice, I think, to run checkers nightly on your staging sites. So they're kind of resource intensive, or not resource so much as time intensive. It takes a while, but to do it as a nightly report, it seems like that could be a good thing. Because I mean, obviously developers have to get educated on this stuff, but you're not going to think of everything all the time. So to actually run checkers as you're developing the site and have it kind of happen automatically in the background on your staging site could be a nice thing, I think, to add to your process generally. Add-ons, just a cautionary note, any add-on that you add can bring accessibility problems, so you should test these things and be aware of what problems lie in store before you use them. Generally raise awareness in the add-on writing community of these issues, file bug reports, provide feedback, etc. And finally, we have this great Travis Jenkins stuff that does a lot of testing, and it would be really nice if we could add accessibility compliance checking to part of that whole process. I don't know how feasible that is. Like I said, caveat, not a developer, but it seems like that could be a really useful thing to incorporate as part of Plone's official testing process, since it's something that we really value in this community and we really want to try to make Plone stand out in this area. All right. Time for your questions or discussion. Yeah. You wanna? You could maybe just say briefly, and I'll rephrase for the mic.
So,
Or talk loudly.
in requires all public institutions for not only being accessible, but also to indicate that on their website by making reports out of it. And
So just to catch you up, Alex is saying that there's a new EU law, essentially, directive that requires all public institutions to provide accessibility.
so yeah, and there's actually a way described by the Web Accessibility Initiative how to make a report, how many of your subsites are accessible. You have to declare if your site is not accessible or which pages and documents on the page is not accessible at all. And there's a lots of things to do within it. And I guess as Plone is a fantastic tool and used by lots of universities, governmental institutions and so on, we should do a lot to support them to get it into it. And the largest problem I always see is that the designers are not aware to make a good design that is accessible in itself. And it's
so
more
when you
about
hear-
training designers, developers to get an awareness of accessibility.
Yeah.
There's a lots of tools and everything around, but tools can only catch up to 90-95% of the problems. There's a lot of things to do. It's like testing. You do not catch everything. You need persons looking at it.
Yeah, yeah. And I didn't really go into tools at all, but talk to Paul if you want to have a rundown of all the great accessibility checking tools that are available now. And yeah, anybody that's hiring a design firm these days, it just wasn't really on my mental agenda back in 2016. So yeah, make sure that they're running those checkers on the design that they're creating, for sure.
Yeah, my question was basically about recommendable tools for doing the checking, because there are lots of tools available and everyone giving different results. And
So
are
hand that mic.
there any canonical good tools to recommend?
Hand that mic to Paul, because I can't answer that.
No, it's hard to give the definite tool. The X tools are quite good, AXE.
Which, by the way, is the tool that's integrated with Castle. So I would love
Yeah.
to see that get integrated.
That is pretty good. The W3G tools are not good. The accessibility checkers, they give like 20 million false positives, which is super annoying. If you have resources, a very good one is Askatasun. It's ASQATASUN. It's available as a Docker image, but it's a monster. It needs like 8 gigs of memory because it's a full JavaScript or Java heavy application, but it's been in use by the French government. It's really good. It can automate a lot, but as said, it's very heavy. But it is an extremely good tool.
And would that be a tool to consider trying to incorporate into the Travis Jenkins process?
We would have to throw resources on hiring a server. Yeah, because it actually needs a...
Yeah, it would need its own server.
It needs its own... It has a Jenkins plugin, so it's easy to integrate, but we would need someone to donate, or we would have to pay for a server to run that, because it's simply heavy. It's not something you run on a $1 a month virtual machine.
Right, got it. Okay, good to know.
No?
Anybody else? Thought you were grabbing the mic because you had a burning question. All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks very much.